Hello everyone, today we talk about the so-called Intercisa or Intercisa, but we're already in late Roman times, so the restituta is somehow changing towards vernacular helmet. It's not the first time we analyze single typologies of Roman, mostly we've done them just with the Romans, maybe the Illyrians at some point, helmets. We did that mostly in the beginnings of Schwerpunkt. To the degree we've lost a bit of touch with this more material side of the story, which is always crucial, fundamental. If we had just to explain it in a traditional sense, everything is the reflection of both natures. It doesn't even make sense to try to distinguish the moral or material dimension. Always bear in mind that there is a spirit that produces this. This is not what we're going to talk about today. Today we look at this helmet that some historians would tell you it's not necessarily the most widespread in the later Roman army, but I think it actually was. We will understand now better why it came to exist in this way. There is a great analogy with the Montefortino from the Middle Republican to the early Imperial era, albeit they are in fact different helmets, but there are some aspects in common we will illustrate now. All right, I already made an introduction to late Roman arms and armor, so let's go into this. Right, so the Intercisa helmet. First of all, it takes the name after, as you know, a locality, actually like the Intercisa camp in Pannonia Inferior in today's Hungary. Of course, like this is an archaeological site rather than a toponymy, modern toponymy. And we have this stuff like pretty much around. We know both from archaeological and iconographic evidence that this was a pretty straightforwardly widespread type of helmet, which is of course confirmed by the general characteristics that were essentially relative cheapness, ease of assembly. Right, it has this straightforward design, quickly gaining traction. Right, as a probably as a novelty to an extent, but we have to explain also why it had come about, what had existed before. And so, of course, not explaining it through a materialistic, deterministic fashion, as people would do if they stop, especially to arms and armor, like children do when study military history, to figurines and illustrations. Here I managed to create something relatively entertaining through AI, but my AI at least is very historically accurate. The times, well, the places, we know them in general, the Roman Empire, but the times are crucial here. This beginning in the latter part of the 3rd century, this new style of helmet starts to appearing. First of all, was it similar to any other helmet used at the same time by other peoples? In this case, yes. I think it may be a slightly overrated aspect of the story, and we'll explain now why, but the features and construction techniques of the Intercisa helmet reflect considerable inspiration, at least in, again, design and the essence of what this helmet was about, from certain models of the Sasanian Persians, who had replaced, as you know, around this very time, the Parthians on the eastern borders in the early 3rd century. This is a very complicated time in Roman, in this case also in Persian history for that matter. So there are lots of things going on that we can try to unpack in order to explain why these people's militaries would now need these types of helmets. First of all, the resemblance is, in my opinion, again, overrated. to an extent. People tend to look at different types of swords, of helmets, of armor. First of all, taking them as an absolute standard, like meaning that even that single typology couldn't come out in different quality or materials, and in fact, as we will see now, subtypes that technically show us that there wasn't really the type of standardization that we intend in a modern sense, especially in this craftsmanship. Some, of course, historiographical terminology hints at things like industrial production, whatever. Yes, you can apply to it without, of course, equating it, in fact, to modern contemporary history in that regard. But even for, more straightforward questions like, what's better, a curved or straight blade? Like, this is like asking whether a black or white cat, right, is better at catching mice, right? It's, of course, slightly different in nature. And, of course, there is all a technicality that you can look at, in this case, the physics of the sword. We often explain how, of course, certain particular types of arms and armor really fit a particular context, and there is always a practical coherence to it. It's never random, right? Even apparently, aesthetical just elements like decorations, etc., they're never purely ornamental. There is always a practical functionality, right? An ergonomy, a broader effectiveness that is also coming out of a very, widespread application, right, of these equipment in, at large scale. And again, not just in the sense that it's produced from a moment to another by someone that decides that this must be the new type of helmet, like in this case, or not, but because, in fact, there aren't radical differences in the way you can make a helmet, a shield, a sword, and especially because the differences between the various military cultures are, especially at this time, relatively negligible, meaning that the way that really makes the difference on the battlefield is whether you want to rip off the intestines of the person in front of you. That's objectively what matters, way before what kind of tools you're going to use in order to achieve that, right? And people have a very, very, very hard time realizing this, right? Because they have been probably brought up in a context in which they have been told that simple, superficial explanations must make for all, right? Because intelligence is too challenging. Superhuman standards are something hysterically separated, probably from the needed reality in the disturbed minds of these people. And so the notion that, for example, warfare basically gets down to how you're armed, like look at every even respectable Hima's channel on YouTube, like in the comments, in the Facebook pages, and look at what people actually ask and what they're actually asking about, aside from things that have nothing to do with history, like dumb jokes and at similar, but in general, like try to find there any strictly opological idea behind it. There's not, right? There are, again, tendencies that we're aware of, but even in that case, and again, I discussed this especially and a lot in the Eurasian Steppes Warfare series, right? In that case, properly even, trying to explain why every centimeter less or more in a blade or a more or less curved one like would make the difference, and especially why, right? Of course, we know since Xenophon explicitly that a curved blade is tendentially more effective for mounted combat, and depending also on which one. But aside from the fact that weapons act within a system, meaning that it's never just a weapon, but even the type of target, how you are equipped, that's part of a much more complex system. But there are situations that are, of course, not optimal, because actually warfare is never an optimal carried out. Humanity it never exists in optimal conditions, but there may be in fact external factors to a strictly military one for which you simply can't be equipped all the time in a certain way or another. In fact, when you look at these arms and armor types, you realize that much of the wall sticks to simplicity, effectiveness, good enough standards rather than overly complicated or overly refined things. And there are interesting changes. The same Roman army of the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD, for example, shows this with cavalry helmets that at some point became hyper sophisticated. Then the 3rd, in the span of a couple of generations, and then 3rd century crisis arrived, things changed completely. And at such a greater speed than what you could see throughout the early empire, that obviously tells you that there is something going on beyond the strictly military side of the story. Because yes, the Romans start facing sort of more effective enemies to an important extent, the Germanic confederacies, the same Sasanian Persians. But that's also a gradual process. It's not just like happening overnight. Technically, these peoples become so more aggressive on the long run because they're actually as heavily Romanized in their military as well. Like if you must explain that why the Germans of Tacitus are not the same ones, say of Julianus, or why in fact the Sasanian Persians even started reforming their military to an extent, apparently because of Roman turncoats. At least that's also a simplistic but still historiographical explanation from the actual times, providing themselves finally with adequate polyurcetic skills, which the Arsacids had been derided for the incompetence with, and similar things. And so, from one side, we do rely on cliches that we get from the times, but from the other, we also realize that there are some internal changes. They're not, say, it's not like they may not be obvious when you see them or even counterintuitive, but they have their own timing, and so we do not fully know, right, even how the thing really happened. My opinion, I'm not an expert on probably the archaeology of the whole thing, also because we know too few, frankly, also about the Sasanians and the same Romans in those centuries for simply, having this straightforward answer to everything that was going on. But it's perfectly plausible that there was some exchange in terms of, if anything, needs, right, or how to fix a certain military system. What sometimes maybe there were just shared similarities, right? The sense, for example, from the Persian side at this point is that they start reacquiring a more consistently, statal center in Mesopotamia. And this is not just like the Iranian plateau that is somehow semi-feudal in nature. And there you start having, in fact, more important infantries in the Sasanian armies, and these infantrymen must be equipped, of course, with the most straightforward defense you can basically use for the foot. That is, first of all, like a helmet. When you look at expenses, of course, like there was a shield and so on, but nothing is that straightforward to tell us, well, the Romans simply copied this from the Sasanians, or got inspired by that. And the designs may be similar, but at the end of the day, the military needs would have occurred before the design was had come around. And still we tend, in fact, not to appreciate how, even though we look at Rome or Persia, at the end of the day there is such a widely shared material culture and general political and social dynamics. This really happens in spite of the differences of the systems that are really different. But that Eurasia has fundamentally the same chronology in terms of ups and downs, of contraction, expansion. So that's not that straightforward even in that way. But This is a moment of crisis for everybody involved, really. Even when there is a success, territorial expansion, etc., you have very pressing needs. And especially like Rome is the stronger power here, so any pressure that she puts, if anything, brings also the enemies to look at how they can cope with her with means that were similar to the same Roman ones. Right? This is one consideration. The other, of course, is the one pointed out by many scholars, including James and Klambach, arguing that the rapid prevalence of the Intercisa helmet, which was quite different from earlier models, can largely be linked to the efficiency of production in state-run factories during a time marked by significant political unrest and reduced output from private workshops, right? And so the idea behind this is that although these helmets provided less protection than traditional single-piece designs, they fulfilled the essential requirements set by the state. Now, this explanation is really not an explanation. I mean, it still poses the a priori question, is to say, okay, but why did this change? Like, what kind of troops did they need to equip? Was it just, because of a major crisis? Weren't there other, more robust type of helmets? And were these also, less resistant helmets really that bad at the end of the day? Really that ineffective overall? And what kind of enemies, like, these kind of troops had really to cope with? Because there is also the broader difference of the differentiation we'll see now of ridge helmet that the Intercisa is part of, but there are sort of much stronger ones. Then later, especially in the period, you have the Spangenhelm affirmation, which is another principle, is aimed at greater resistance, and mostly there is, however, a stratification of the type of strength. For example, the Intercisa is the cheapest of these helmets as types on average. Then you have, say the Berkasova ones, then you have the Spangen helmet. So you have a rise in quality, in construction complexity, etc. But the question is also which kind of troops really fought and why, right? Why did now the Roman army need simply, state factories that they had not really needed in other times? And still, why would this now public workshops specifically require this type of helmet? Yes, again, one factor we illustrated. This was a great moment of crisis, right? Yet the Intercisa is also, actually the very find of Intercisa dating to 1909 dates from the latter half of the 4th century. So we are actually well after the same, just this is anecdotal, of course, there were Intercisas before. I don't mean that it's strictly typical from that specific period, but you have had not just the end of the third century crisis, the so-called restoration of the world, but you have had a major military reform under Diocletian and Constantine. You have what we call the Constantinian army that basically remains a major steamroller in strictly tactical terms, like the most highly performing Roman army of antiquity. When we look at the defensive and offensive potential from a technical point of view, that was not really a time of crisis in conventionally intended sense, right? I am actually, one of those historians stressing that, of course, the system had already been somehow damaged from the previous centuries. Especially, you start feeling it's not much a material loss, but a sense of moral loss. We talked about the paradigm shift in late antiquity. It's a broader historical process that was predating that and is still going on today. So you can look at this increasing, refinement also in the technicality and variety, for example, of the a Roman panoply, some kind of diversion from the originary metaphysical spring of divinity that Romano-Italic people had brought, like to invade this world territory, and controlling, molding it, and so on. You have there a bit of Byzantine, Hellenic, theoricistic and intellectualistic bias, also towards technology and sort of almost fireworks, right, surprise effects, etc. But there is also a pretty darn advanced military, right? You can't look also at the neighbors of the Roman Empire and saying, well, yes, they have also increased in military qualities, but they're also faring particularly better. No, they aren't. Like, the Germanic confederacies set themselves in motion because, like, pretty bad things were happening in the steppes, and they start going at one another. It was a generalized crisis for them as well. Also, their society stratifies. The same goes for the Sasanians to a degree. Like, these are not like the very, say, quasi-tribal. I made a recent video about the Arsacid army or organization, like people springing out of the, say, fundamentally out of the steppes through the Iranian plateau. It's a different world for everyone, right? So you can't just single out, again, the Roman Empire, this or that polity, pretending that, these are sort of different peoples doing different things that have nothing to do with one another. In the case of the Sasanians, you can see a bit like the same reasons, in fact, occurring throughout. Like, the Germans didn't have sort of more concentrated power to have something similar to Roman state factories. Also, the Sasanians were actually not completely there yet. They had sort of more of a feudal, private, oligarchic system, but they also needed now to feel like some more state-like army from Ctesiphon in a region that had historically provided with sound infantries in general, so they have the need. So what's the deal, right? The deal is obvious if you know, of course, the societal fundamentals of this all. I made multiple videos about not much the 3rd century crisis as a whole, right? You still have to get into the specifics, and also in an overall explanation. But we've seen, if anything, what Roman society was already from Diocletian's times onwards, right? Something that would define, in fact, as more Byzantine. And I discussed this at length for Byzantine history as well, like the type of that general political and societal balance in the empire from this point, that the same Roman Empire is becoming ever more oligarchic. This tendency towards the aristocratization is evident also in the Germanic world at large. This is happening practically everywhere. There are ever more, ever fewer richer people and ever more poorer people. And as a consequence, there is much less reliance overall on a, scattered system of production, right? This is even precedent the need to establish publicly owned armories, because the frontiers are unstable. There are usurpers in the provinces, so you want to centralize arms and armor factories in the core Mediterranean regions of the empire. There are also, of course, the richest, the best served, etc. It's also a matter of how this army works now, right? How the military reflects that societal segmentation. And you know that in the Roman army there are now more elite troops from one side that in fact do not tend to be armed with protected by, for example, the Intercisa helmet, which is instead way more typical of the sort of rank and file soldier, right, of the sort of lighter heavy infantry type, and also skirmish of lighter infantry to begin with. Which obviously makes a lot of sense, because if this type of helmet is cheaper than, say, the previous one, thinking about the Italic, the Gallic types, etc., they were pretty like bulky individuals, sort of like we tend to see the Romans as sort of disciplined soldiers fighting in collective formation. The great part of the success of the Roman army was having that as the hallmark of course, of military efficiency, but still, say, encouraging that level of individualistic warriorism that Roman Italic fighter really still had, like, given that Rome had sprang out of a tribal background relatively short time before this. And this is, we will see it later also, a difference with Montefortino type of helmet that can't parallel, however, still that cheap mass production that started being ever more there, at least with subcontracted, statally subcontracted armorers since the time of, it would be the Marian Reform. Cicero is the first source describing this explicitly, but sort of the idea of the large mass of cheaply manufactured, quasi-statally owned armorers deriving helmets for the heavy, for the Roman legionaries fundamentally. So we're talking 125,000 soldiers across all the empire, doubled because there are as many auxiliaries as well, which is not even a particularly large army, because, you know, up to the 3rd century there hadn't been fundamentally any disturbance of this political and strategical hegemony of Rome on basically all the peoples that were not just directly under her control, but also in the outskirts. So this is the fundamental explanation. There is, down to the battlefield level, a tactical segmentation of the troops, for which you have many more lighter troops compared to what the older legionnaire had fundamentally been. This may actually be some, let's say this is true because we tend to see, like, the Roman military simply falling in quality to some sort, and this is very wrong. I made a couple of videos explaining this specifically, and again, if you look at the Constantinian army, definitely this is the most effective against the strongest enemies that Rome has ever faced, right, in the 4th century AD. And there you have to account for what happened with the Romanization of the empire, the fact that those half of the Roman army, constituted by effectively foreigners, now does not exist anymore, because those foreigners have become Roman themselves. And so those tactical roles that they performed as lighter troops accompanying the heavier, bulkier legionary infantry, that is in fact the decisive element in the Roman army, have now become Roman legionnaires themselves. And so you couldn't simply double that model. It's mostly a moral problem. Like over the centuries, this whole system is not like before. We said it. This is true also for the surroundings. I don't know, the Tacitus Germans fought in a sort of much more egalitarian style compared to one another, right? By this time, instead, they're brought under aristocracies. You have, even in the Germanic armies, like the elite element that basically mirrors the same Roman one, and then you have this lighter guys that are sort of ever more politically subordinated to them, that fight in a lighter fashion, right? And in the Roman army, you have something similar. Like, the standards are different. The statal discipline and professionalism are still like top-notch, except, however, they're unevenly distributed among the troops compared to the previous eras, at least when you look at now the fully legionary, say, statal army, right? So you need, they're not literally the same people. I mean, it's their ancestors, of course, but for those people that had initially began as auxilia, as numeri, etc., fighting in sometimes very primitive attire with very, say, rustic and cheap, like sort of almost homemade armament, now needing somebody else producing their equipment, also because their descendants have gentrified. They probably don't have like even those military skills, like those ethnic specialties at some point that had made them so useful, also as more tactically expendable troops, but ones that can use combined arms, again accompanying the legionary heavy infantry. So it's actually a lot of people, right? Consider that when the empire gets more defensive at large, we also stress too much how this was the case in the later Roman Empire. This is tendentially true, like compared to the previous times, but normally it was a status quo. Rome, if you launched an invasion of Roman territory, sooner or later the Romans would have retaliated. So it's not even just conceptually that, but the idea is now that indeed a larger amount of people living in the empire now becomes ever more autonomous as well in the defense of their provinces because of all these usurpations. It's also a lot of Roman against Roman warfare. Never forget this, that every people's arms and armor are largely designed historically to primarily cope with themselves. This is a very overlooked aspect. You never hear, the Romans began to change their equipment because, they were fighting against one another. Let's find out the reason. No, it's because, I don't know, the army was getting Germanized or barbarized or whatever. That's not how it works, all right? And even when a specific design is attributed, like even in this case, to this or that external people, this rigid separation of that people got it from the other because that's how they mechanically copy you. Well, no, that's not how it works. Like, if that had been the case, you're not explaining why that is happening, right? Good ideas does not mean, okay, there's a people who are stupid and the other who isn't, and so that guy grabs that and that other can't do anything about it. There is a special secret invention that you don't have to show this other people, otherwise it will copy it and then it will defeat you. And also how, if these peoples were so advanced, because the narrative is that the Romans copied everything from everyone. They didn't have anything on their own. Yeah, as if, there wasn't an actual Roman heartland to that when this stuff was heavily, put together, but on still the basis of a very original, like there is hardly any more original military culture than the Roman one to begin with. But again, people fixate with material side of the story, and so nobody knows why, the Romans, by stealing things from others, would have taken over everybody, right? Because the things are two, or either these ones were stupid or they were weak, right? And those who whined continuously against the Romans in this sense, of course, we would say the opposite is true, because they were the strongest people. They were so much better. The Romans were just, eating cereals, and instead these were the warriors. And they got exterminated. Guess why? Because somebody, if they had the best weapons, they were best men and everything, why did the system fail so miserably? Nobody really knows. So there's a very deep misunderstanding about the actual essence of military culture, and even the individual peoples you're discussing, because there wasn't actually that much or different at all between, say the Italic peoples or the Celtic peoples or the Germanic people, even just in a ethno-anthropological sense, right? Anthropometrically, we're talking basically the same population, but for some reason, people are obsessed with these things because they simply can't accept how the world works. Now we have people on X thinking that they can't get an actual information from social networks, and you can't understand what the definition of a lesser human being is. And of course, that's why also people do not understand history. They're absolutely phrenestonically threatened, right, to the level of actual, anxiety crisis by any trace of standard human even, right? Not even just, mainly one, but probably the idea that they have to do anything as people. That's the single most terrifying thing ever. And this is all projected, again, in the way, especially internet culture that is ever more penetrating for this very reason is becoming. But of course, there are still standards somewhere. The point I was making, though, is that, of course, the type of troops that now the Romans have to equip are largely fighting themselves in sort of a more combined armed fashion, right? Because between the crisis, the also relative material shortage, etc., that is, you see, less important than this eventual distribution of resources in the army itself. They tend to find like sort of more complex solutions, things that can work in an ever more energy saving fashion, right? It's not that the crushing weight of the military, also in the previous centuries, was not pushing toward that direction, but now the situation is sort of more difficult. And in the end, the Romans do not make it, right? Or at least the empire system, like not much because of military, but primarily for political reasons, gives way in so many large areas of the empire itself to peoples that, again, were not even sort of military more qualitative than them in a strictly technical sense. So there's when you have indeed also those same peoples installing themselves and starting to use ever more like Roman stuff, because they want to preserve that, right? The Federati themselves, to a large degree, were armed with the same stuff. The Visigoths, the so-called Visigoths, single most Romanized people among the Germanic ones that settled in the empire, and of any other, I think, in that sense, among the invaders, was created in a political sense as the Roman army of Illyricum, literally substituting itself from a demographic point of view to the actual manpower base that had once occupied Illyricum, or that now was running out of the demographic crisis. And so again, nobody was really winning to that degree by which there is one culture that manages to impose itself on another. In an absolute term, there is nothing short of a syncresis, and the Intercisa here perhaps is not the best example of that, but still, the sense that you must have a more elite core of some sort, supported by troops that are ever more autonomously stationed, because they have also to defend the frontier from a standpoint which at least will ensure some degree of motivation from their side, and for which otherwise, the state could not pay for, is exemplified by this, right? There is probably some deeper need here for this specific design that, however, is particularly lost in history. At least this is where some reenactor, some humanist will tell you, maybe this is the reason, because if anything, just by wearing it on a regular basis, you can point certain aspects out. But even about that, first of all, you're not into a 4th century military context. You do not even know to the fullest how this stuff was really worn, at least through the way you can reconstruct it today in 2024. So I'm overwhelmingly skeptical about the positivity of most of these activities for the sake of historical understanding. Yet there is definitely a sense of compactness and effectiveness in the Intercisa helmets that is not just, okay, this was the cheaply designed, produced helmet. It wasn't a bad helmet at all. It had consistently protective capacities that, especially for the troops, tasked with particular tactical functions, was even consistent, where it was even expensive to a degree. So never underestimate, especially how a certain point in late antiquity, like material resources are kind of running out, and the same demographic ones are so even more important. And of course, the manpower had to be well defended, well protected in relation to the material availability of the time. So do not look down on the Intercisa helmet, because first of all, it's not just like there is a reason why it's there, but this reason does not mean it's a bad, scarce quality equipment at all. In fact, as we will see now, many officers use the Intercisa as well. And so even though there are sort of heavier types of helmet, pertain mostly in fact to often mounted troops and sort of a greater elite force, especially at the beginning of the period, the distinction is not so overwhelming, right? We have the idea, of course, of the comitatenses and the limitane, but at the beginning of the introduction of the system, for example, the latter were not really, the limitane, I mean, were not really that worse equipped than compared to the comitatenses. It's mostly something that gradually comes to happen. And of course, it's inherent in the double standards. Like the comitatenses are a real field army. They really perform in different ways. And just the other day we were talking about the 6th, 7th century Byzantine army. At that point, the limitane basically evaporate, even as local levies or militias, or at least they're not. There's an increasing feudalization of the system. And but even at that point, you have the end of state-run factories of some sort, right? Or at least some local production with produce similar helmets. Because at the end of the day, you can argue, and we'll see now what the Intercisa design is about. Like that's, again, the single most straightforward way you can make a helmet in many ways. And so that's a winner over time. The type of helmets used at some point, the most elaborate ones, are also the shortest lived ones, which is something you may want to consider in general. Now, in 1909, around 20 examples from the latter half of the 4th century were discovered at the aforementioned Intercisa-Dunapentele in Hungary, Pannonian Inferior Roman times, showcasing several shared characteristics. Right? Again, these helmets are not identical. There is no such thing like, a standardly produced fashion for these single types. I mean, coming from out of a same armory, tendentially, yes, you can imagine some helmets properly made in series, because if anything, the artisan who made them tended to have his ways, and he would have at least attempted to make them as similar as possible. But again, we are in pre-industrial times. Things do not quite work in that, okay, everything is just a stamp and the helmet will come out like that. That's not how it works. Now, the Intercisa-Dunapentele types are, of course, like exemplary by definition. Each helmet consists of 2 pieces which are connected along a raised seam with rivets. Right? This is why leading Anglo-Saxon scholars use this term ridge helmets, which is not applied just to the Intercisa, because of course there is a similar construction here to refer to them. As you understand, this is, as we were saying before, this is not as solid, for example, as a Gallic or Italic early imperial type of helmet, right? But at this time, you also had the Montefortinos, as a matter of fact. You had other forms, and again, it's not like these helmets are made all in the same quality to begin with. So indeed, there is a fall in the actual robustness in general by construction, because you have this 2 pieces that are just, in fact, connected, and that's the vulnerable part. So it's, say, if you're getting a spata hit from the above, it's not really going to be extremely healthy for the stability of this helmet. But that's also baked into the equation. I mean, of course, these helmets construction had a particular resistance that is also based most in terms of strictly military effectiveness and performance on usury. Right? It's not like these helmets are simply going to split in two because somebody hits you like that. Most blows you're gonna take anyway are extremely random and not, in fact, coming that perfect angle that is going to and power that is going to smash the actual helmet in two just because it's built like that. And you may want to consider it, right? Because the Montefortino, for example, is significantly like a single skull cap, right? So in that case, you have sort of a great resistance, yes, but you can also pierce this thing. You can smash it in many ways. Like, it's not unbreakable. And the same goes for any material object, obviously enough. Now, back to the Intercisa-Dunapentele, the nape guards and cheek plates are distinct parts that attach to the helmet, not directly or through metal hinges, but instead through flexible supports made from leather or fabric. This is also a cheaper construction, but at the end of the day, what are also the odds that you're going to receive a blow that is just per se causing this specific damage, right? Again, yes, less robust helmet, but what radical difference is going to make to begin with? Like, cheek pieces are very important to protect most effect from side blows, and the sense is that the Montefortino habitually had this, like most helmets at the time had them, right? There were of course you could wear, actually this is showed in some Eastern take part in Sasanian art, like there are some the skull caps without cheek guards, because in fact less sophisticated way of arming yourself, which is typical really of most people precisely around in non-statal systems, even a cap of some sort, like not even a metal helmet, but something also of that shape. There are examples of this, like think about there are issues like in the higher Middle Ages, for example, those sort of Phrygian caps that at some point we don't understand whether they're, of course, the later helmet form, say the most typical one in the 12th century, or they were, I don't know, even in Anglo-Saxon England, something, I don't know, more like fashion, like some sort of felt caps of some sort. The Romans, by the way, used them as well. Like, it's not like they used just the factory, the fabricae products, or that they can't actually produce them alone. What is often underestimated, rather than the obvious fact that, say, these legionnaires had their own possessions, their own ways of purchasing stuff, they would have a sort of more comfortable attire wore most of the time, is that Roman legionnaires often produced their own arms and armor in the legionary camps. And for actually most of the early empires, of the one that people project rightfully to an extent, of course, the greatest level of power and sort of even material abundance to a degree, which is I'm not going to digress on this, but again, like, it was actually the case, because again the mistake is mostly attributing to this hyper centralized bureaucratic or arms or armor supplying system, like the standard of the army just per se, right? It is in part true, like you can't cross out civilization of the equation, but there is a, let's say, a perfect balance at some point. The systems achieve some sort of a peak balance in terms of effectiveness that really is a blend between the two. So it's not so balanced towards unbalanced towards one side or the other, right? And so, actually, the single most steadily supplied Roman army is the one between of the 4th century, basically. But again, in a different context, again, with very, very high military standards of effectiveness and performance. Here I'm recording in between pauses, so I don't remember why I got to this point. The reason why I make such a long video for the Intercisa is that it has to match more or less the type of length of the other content, but it is just an excuse because, of course, these concepts do matter, right? You can't simply go out there and say, I'm an expert about the Roman army because, I know what kind of arms and armor they were using in this or that time, which often stops just to that still iconic way, meaning that, of course, the noob level is thinking that, I don't know, like in some series they made, even when we were little, that, I don't know, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, Roman legionnaires would look like the ones in Trajan's times. But, say, having this standardized, you often see that on YouTube, the standardized idea that just, I don't know, there's one type of legionnaire for this era or another, right? Even for the single most, if you're talking legionnaires proper, just for the early empire, is heavily incorrect, right? If you want to have like a pretty good idea of the incredible variety of arms and armor in the Roman army throughout all this period, or specific ones, just by seriously a book. Even ospreys are good if you're not into bigger, sort of more scientific publications from archaeologists, etc. But you can get the references to those also from such simple publications that have increased in quality. Telling the truth, I mean, Osprey has been improving to a degree, but it doesn't have, let's say, that overarching sort of extra critical capacity. But say when it gets to single elements evidence, as a collector of quick but correct references at this point, yeah, that's good. And the overall idea, I was pointing out, is that you must understand, in fact, how the system was in not just in a specific era or another, but why we're even talking about these different eras, right? And it's not about debunking the approximation; it's explaining the approximation. It's a very, very, very different thing. And that's sort of the top level that you can achieve. Of course, like, you can be an expert in arms and armor of the period, you can, but before that, you have to have a pretty solid understanding of the art of war, of arms and armor production, some degree of sort of material culture, archaeology, and having read really a lot. Otherwise, you can't even properly provide with a convincing explanation for what you're discussing. Going back to some other characteristics of the Intercisa type, frequently the edges of the cheek plates, for example, in caps are perforated for threading internal padding. This is very important because we don't see too much arming caps or padded armor to begin with, like much in antiquity. There's a debate around this. That the main problem is that we don't have much of an organic residue, right, due to the latter's deterioration. In archaeology, there are some interesting debates about this, and this does get very technical to the actual finds and how, say, literally, objects, substances deteriorate and so on. But of course, like, this was needed to absorb the hits, just not to have just the sheer metal just at contact of the skin, for example, was a necessity. And these perforations left the same ears uncovered, right, resulting in a design that sacrifices some degree of protection for enhanced ventilation. Never underestimate, especially years exposure, right? Yes, there's this massive, bulky, say, early imperial helmets, overloaded with protections, with additional elements, but the ear is open because receiving orders correctly was crucial. That alone from the helmet is such a very powerful indicator of the highly collective training that these soldiers were provided, and that in order to cope with real and habitual challenges on the battlefield, right? So like in many other times in history, like helmets can and will be open, and they will not cover everything, and there are differentiations because of how this piece is designed to go into combat, right? We've seen it for so many levels. You know it. We made so many videos about medieval armor that is even more elaborated. And this does give you properly the dimension of how fluid, from one side, like properly arms and armor development really is, according to the circumstances, but at the same time, how, in fact, the type of warfare these troops were engaged in is not radically altered in the essentials. And this is true for centuries and centuries, right? So there are these different types of helmets that confer this, the specific advantages, disadvantages, but they just, even with very different designs, for certain things you find this basic ear exposure when you realize that these guys were sort of to obey orders in a very mechanical fashion. They had to perform very complicated maneuvers, just banally, right? The 13th century great helm for medieval heavy cavalry, you realize it's all closed, and in fact it severely hampered hearing, sight, or just this thin eye slits to avoid receiving a lance in the face from the other guy on horseback. There are all these little holes for aeration next to the cheeks, close to the mouth, that also didn't have to be exposed, right, too much, because it could be a dangerous, could weaken, like, properly the frontal part where you go. So there are all these reasons that had come to be. Like, what is fascinating, unfortunately, is that we don't have the actual documents of, say, a smith of the times, of an armorer of the time, saying, look, we make helmets like this because of this and that reason in their own wars. We can evidently see that, but just think of how, considering also how standardized these designs really were across all of Europe and spreading in a few years practically everywhere in contemporary, without, for the practical needs at hand, but also for sort of the international level of military, say, military sharing in terms of experiences and so on, how effective really the adaptation to a certain military context really was at the time. So when we look, say, at, for example, we never think, when we look at the Middle Ages, people are generally speaking less knowledgeable about arms and armor, because things get also a bit more complex. But for the ancient world, everybody seems to have an opinion, and there is always this attitude of looking down on these changes, like as if you were the expert who actually went at war at the time and told you, no, this is better, this is worse, or this is the best type of that. This is complete nonsense whatsoever, right? And you still have people, actual adult people, thinking that saying these things provides them with this aura of expertise, while they more like look like children who whine because they want undeserved attention. Now, traces of silver around the rivets suggest that the Intercisa helmets were often silver-plated and embellished with various decorative designs, which actually does not make these helmets particularly cheap items in a general sense, right? Even officers, again, normally use this stuff, and as we said before, it's not even about the design, the construction per se. It's about the quality. It's about also some aesthetical reasons to a degree, but they're functional, for example, to be more insight on the battlefield, which is very important. We will see now how crests were also a thing on these helmets as others. Never underestimate the sacred value that the soldiery has in the ancient world. That's also an aspect we tend to skip here. These weapons were meant to really represent some sort of Promethean capacity, like a human adaptation to the forces of the universe, right? It was probably an idea of heroism in the same, say, image of the warrior per se. Think about Byzantine art, the icons, and how much like also late antique or classical models were looked upon with great admiration and inspiration still, in times in which they didn't even need to use those anymore. Many Intercisa helmets feature a series of stylized raised patterns, commonly displaying a pair of eyes, for example, on the front, a bit like on ship prows, right, in the ancient world. This tells you how, I'll explain it now, how religiously meaningful this thing really was. This was mostly on the front or engraved crosses on the cap as well. This is not even much because of the Christianization of the empire. There were some universal symbols that, as you know, we discuss every once in a while, that had to do, of course, with imperial Catholic tradition mostly, but the idea, for example, of having some eyes over the helmet. What was that, really? That there were some pseudo-Arctic helmet that at some point mimic even the same frontal part of the helm, as if over the helm, on the head of the wearer, that would have been protected in the actual frontal part of the helmet in a different way. In part, there is a sense of divine transfiguration into this. It's a bit like, the warrior, the beast warriors, right? We've seen it also for the Romans, of course, on many occasions, the signithary. The idea that you're basically possessed and possessing at the same time a superhuman force, right? That there is a spirit that envelopes you, that is basically one that you can master to get through its divine meaning, in fact, a superhuman force, and that can help you develop in it and sort of signaling your status in the world, in war, in society, etc. Right? So this is not merely a simple design, a simple pattern. It's as if there was literally a spirit living into it, and people living at the time all believed the same identical thing regarding that. So we tend to see this, look, it's cute because it's classy or aesthetical, but it's actually provided with a very specific meaning. Unfortunately, it's been largely lost, but we can reconstruct more or less along these patterns of explanation. And of course, there would be all kind of customization, personalization, also on top of the actual item as it came out of the state-run factory. Right. This is typical also of previous times. You could even buy weapons from somewhere else, but we know very well that even in this more basically standardized equipment, it really means just having some basic equipment. Then how the typologies could vary, and they would vary a lot. You could add on it. So from the provinces we know that we have very specifically local styles, patterns of decoration, whatever. This is very important to get. Like, there is a function which ties much more to a moral dimension that will motivate the soldiers, that as important as the technical side of the story. So when we talk about standardization, really, in these times, like saying, in Marian times, it's not like every single legionnaire was the same at all. What it means is that as a basis of sustainability, the soldier must be equipped with, say, armor, body armor, an oval, let's say a broader shield, a helmet, a sword, and some heavy javelins. This is it, right? Then you can add on it extra layers of armor, greaves, The shields can vary in shape. So by standardized, many people think like they literally looked all alike. The sports were all alike. The armor was all alike. No, they were not, right? And a great deal of why they weren't is also that the soldiers were of course allowed to make these changes, right? Actually, still, like, there is this notion that after Marius, legionnaires began to receive weapons, sort of for free. This is absolutely not true, right? There's still that the salary they received was actually was needed to compensate for the loss of the equipment. It was at the legionnaires' expenses, meaning that the salary was added as an extra as well, of course, as a form of payment to sustain the soldier also throughout the campaign, because it's not just about the equipment. Next to what the central system could give them already since the time of the siege of Veii, right? It's not that the Romans had to await Marius for having the state giving them stuff, right? It's another myth that people believe in. But at the end of their service, they had to actually give back the equipment, right? And if they lost that, if they, it was a recovery, they damaged it, whatever, they had to pay for it, right? And the cost would be subtracted from the salary. So think about this, because this is the moment in which there aren't even technically statally run factories, right? It's most privates that receive the subcontracts from the state, right? Which is a different thing. And still, soldiers can enhance on this stuff, can buy also other equipment. But there is also a functionality in warfare that brings them to want, of course, a specific type of equipment rather than another. And also, it's not just they can't spend too much, because otherwise they would have had a very different society with a very different type of fighting, right? It's not like a Roman legionnaire could simply present himself like a medieval knight to service. But in the 4th century, say, still, like the comitatenses, other for like cavalry forces are becoming more important. There is a kind of more knightly type of equipment. Also in there, we could digress, think about the Roman cataphracts. Was there like a single thing, like they were chosen as classes of recruitment before? No, there is a bit of dirigism regarding that from the state as well. These are artificial experiments that also do not really end quite well. I mean, the Roman cataphracts were not that good at all in late antiquity, in the sense also that the more habitual Roman stuff was actually pretty good throughout all the period, and the Romans fundamentally also abandoned that thing as well. But back to the Intercisa, one surviving helmet included, as we were hinting at before, a metal crest, right? Likely designed to support an additional crest made from organic materials that are lost. And so just there are so many helmets that we're keeping to discover that add on to the sort of the, again, basic information that in fact does not change too much. But also from the helmet's reconstruction I put here in the pictures, you can realize how also beautifully colored this whole thing was. Never underestimate how decorated these helmets were, how really little works of art could become, especially if the soldier was affluent enough to afford even such expense, right? This is very important to stress. Now, this particular design of the metal crest seems to have seen widespread use as well, as evidenced, for example, by a crested helmet with eyes, so-called, depicted in a 4th century fresco in Syracuse, Sicily, in the local catacombs of St. John. So to really display, there are also Duroropos frescoes that really show that there is a well-preserved Intercisa specimen found in Augst, Switzerland, former Augusta Raurica, displaying a series of holes and notches on its central relief, which likely served as a fastening mechanism for the metal crest. The so-called Intercisa-Worms, after the Middle Rhine city, that, as you know, was also the seat of the Burgundians at some point during the period and so on, is specifically noted for lacking space around the ears, with a riveted metal band along the back edge of the cap, like in the, say, I don't know, just conceptual, because this has barely anything to do with that in actual size and construction, like the sort of neck guard of the early imperial legionary helmets. Right. Additionally, we have an Intercisa helmet from the 3rd century, created using similar methods and likely meant for cataphract cavalry. This was discovered at the famous site of Dureurapus in Syria, indicating a possible Persian origin for this helmet style. But it's not, as I was saying before, it's not really warranted. The presence of iron mesh protection, this specimen is suggested by various contemporary Persian graffiti, though, right? And so there may have been this shared similarity, but how it had come to being, right, and just why this would be also particularly preferred for cataphract cavalry is not to even say that cataphract, yeah, there were also heavier types of fighters having such more, apparently simple type of helmets. But again, it really depended on how it was. This was combined within the panoply. Also, how resistant these helmets were. How many chances you had, say, on the top of a cataphract horse the size of an elephant, say, at least to quote famous older references, would have been useful, right? If you were already so heavy, for example, like you had, and you were a cavalryman, you could, just entrust your safety, your head protection, to some more robust, still sort of simply constructed thing that would not fear arrow shots, for example. Again, we said it before. One thing is your humble infantryman, and you're going to expect like a sword blow from horseback, for example, top down in movement. That's terrifying. But if you're just like almost unchallenged, and the chances that blow is not really going to arrive that easily, and you're ultra heavily armored in many other ways, and you have, for example, the chances of engaging, or the necessity of engaging even against an enemy that has to do the same thing with you, just with a shorter type of weapon like a mace, right? Yes, you may want, there are heavier types of helmets, but there are sort of different say options at your disposal, and still you're not going to necessarily use always the same type of protection, which is still a protection, and even somehow a good one, as we've seen even in the on the head of officers. And so remember, again, there's a lot of material poverty around in later antiquity compared to previous times, especially towards the latter end. So do not think that this is so simply trivial to say, okay, you just have to count here the maximum type of protection and of elements that give you that. No, right? You can have very interesting solutions that do not really entail that in many ways. Now, this is pretty much it. I don't know how long this is, but let's say in this videos I like to make a bit more of philosophy, let's say, of science still, which actually means a bit like the same thing. But again, I'm always glad when I can sort of shift the attention from the strictly materialistic and deterministic side of the story, and presenting with all the factors that will present themselves unavoidably just from the same analysis to explain the incredible complexity and variability of the system. And so the notion being also that indeed there was a very strictly and concretely material side of the story that you can't sort of relativize just per se. But this also lays in the very essence of this defense, right? And in the varying quality of the same pieces, and in the general difficulty, of course, from us to simply know that much about it to begin with, but also let's say the fact that there wasn't such an overwhelming difference indeed, even in the designs per se, right? And added extra protection at this point is obviously more evident, even more evident, of course, than in the past. Why? Because again, there is that elite element now that you sort of observe as more evidently evident in the category, but that is not actually compared to the Spangenhelm, for example, etc. But it's not actually a because I'm doing something else here. But I meant that is not necessarily alone like the factor that will single-handedly save your life just because, right? So this is, I think, is incredibly important to understand, and say especially not underestimating the relevance of this type of helmet. That shouldn't be seen as just that's the cheap stuff, right? And as I was saying, now remember that yes, there would be more elite troops, but at the same time there were also less in number, and so you must take that into account. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.